Hello, Liam here. Welcome back to Indieventure EXTRA, our bonus series where we interview key members of the games industry. In this episode, I was joined by the truly lovely Xalavier Nelson Jr, the creative director at Strange Scaffold. I've actually wanted to talk to Xalavier for a long time now, so I leapt at the opportunity to interview him about his life, his approach to games at Strange Scaffold, as well as his latest release, the fast-paced arcade shooter I Am Your Beast. This was one of the best interviews of my career. Xalavier is not just a considered thinker, he's also a very warm and inviting person, which made this conversation a delight from start to finish. Anyway, I'll get out of the way. As always, if you have any comments, you can get in touch via email, contact@indieventurepodcast.co.uk. Enjoy the show. My guest today is the creative director of Strange Scaffold, an indie studio responsible for such hits as El Paso Elsewhere, Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator, and An Airport for Aliens currently run by dogs. Joining the industry as a journalist at age 12, this BAFTA-nominated creator has worked on over 100 games over the last 8 years. Welcome to the podcast, Xalavier Nelson Jr.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a real pleasure to meet you. I've been a follower of your work for a long time, and I've enjoyed everything of yours I've played or read, maybe with the sole exception of a very long tweet thread you did in 2020 involving Tomb Raider.
We were all in a bad place. I just made it worse.
It altered my brain chemistry. Worse, maybe worse isn't the word I'd use. I remember sitting in the garden when I read it and actually shouting out loud when I got to the end of it and being like, he's done it. He's got me again. So yes, it's lovely to meet you. So I just want to start off with a quick question. So at the time of recording, you've just shipped your latest game, the frenetic first-person revenge shooter, I Am Your Beast. How are you feeling now that it's in people's hands?
It's incredibly heartening because it's the type of story we don't get to see in games. The reality of game development, and especially selling video games, is you have no idea what is going to hit with anyone. You can look at wishlist numbers, you can look at popular genres. There was a time where everyone was making city builders, for example. But at any given time, you don't know what is the game your players need next. And you have two routes. You can try to reach them where they have been, or you can try to reach them where they will be. And so I'm Your Beast is a game that got canceled twice internally. First time, just it went on a brief hiatus because we had other priorities. The second time, we did it for studio survival. It was not going to get picked up again, and it was Frosty Pop as I was taking them through things that could be a part of our 5-game deal and a overall, the future of our partnership that saw literally very base level prototype footage and believed in us enough to say, yeah, you can and should take a shot at finishing this. This looks like it could be cool. The idea of this could be cool, the idea that publishing a game which may surprise you is, I mean, it sounds very common sense. This is what happens in other industries all the time. But in games, it feels like it's getting increasingly lost. And people who have been in the industry for a real long time, I mean, take how long we've been journalists. When it felt like games would constantly do something new or propose a new genre balance versus now, where whether it's AAA or indie, like it seems that people trust in the term roguelite or roguelike to get you sales. And it's not to knock them or knock those games. So they're cool, but like the tangible fear of, well, what if this doesn't sell, locks us off from the possibilities of what if it does. I had a publisher after Balatro popped off say to me, I really think poker might be in. And if your takeaway from Balatro is that people might love poker, maybe the next big game genre is poker likes, there's something wrong. So apologies for the long-winded answer, but Yeah, I feel incredibly validated that the team is being seen, that we've got another game out, but even more so
Hmm.
than that, that it's a release that could surprise us, and we created the environment for that to happen in the first place. According to that same deal, we've got a co-op kaiju horror cooking game. As I've been talking about a bit on Twitter, through my weird brain logic, that game, when it sees the light of day, will have a setting that is inspired by Name of the Rose. We're we're putting Pentiment shenanigans in our Lethal Company soup. The idea that like it isn't the thing that is the immediate first step you'd look for when looking at the algorithm, but it may be the next game that players need, and we have the opportunity to explore it in the first place, learning
Yeah.
all the while. I'm just incredibly grateful that Strange Scaffold exists, if only for my own brain, because otherwise it would be very easy to get very cynical about where we're at in games right now, and
Yeah.
to feel the deeply consistent fear that I'm seeing and hearing from developers and publishers across the entire medium of, I don't know what publishers want. I don't know when and how developers will ship a thing. I just want to sell copies and for people to be happy. And the players stuck in the middle aren't happy either, because they're seeing games at the largest scales that they ever have been not satisfy their needs as human beings, or as people who want like entertainment at the end of the day. It's a really cohesively, holistically kind of miserable situation for a lot of the people here.
Yeah. It's a topic that I think we will absolutely touch on through this interview. I think it's something that you are very publicly vocal about and have a lot of very interesting things to say. What's really got me about your answer there is, I mean, the refrain, do it because it might be cool. It's sad that that might be the first time I've ever heard that used while talking about, publishers. And like you said, wanting to take a risk is difficult, right? Like it's, especially in the current climate. When you mentioned there about trying to find what your players need next and trying to guess that, do you think doing things because they're cool is the trick, or do you have more of a solid approach to trying to answer that question?
I'd say that the kind of holistic consideration there is, I'm not trying to sell people one game, I'm trying to sell them five, if we're going to be in the use the most gauche terminology possible. So I try to just be artistically consistent. What is the next thing that inspires me, gets me excited, and is something that can be built likely within a year or less? That point between the business and the art is what inspires me. And in the oral history we did around clickholding, where it was sitting in that room and saying, this game exists best in the moment at like a $25,000 price point. We can make something really cool, really distressing in 2 months. And that's where it makes sense to build it. And also, this is the type of thing I care about saying in the world. There's a lot of player trust there. There's a little bit of honest fear, because like saying like, I really think people want to play a game about a distressing masked man in the corner of your hotel room who wants you to click a tally counter. But the way I thought about it when I was starting the studio was similar to your favorite author or musician or director. If people wanted to hear and see what I would do next, and if I delivered it consistently enough, quickly enough, then I could take them almost anywhere. And there's parts of that are stressful. There's parts of that are extremely difficult. But again, it also means when I'm preparing my next pitch for, say, Frosty Pop, the first thing that I'm thinking is not what's selling on Steam today. It's looking at what we can execute on and at the studio. Like, what's the idea and the production level core that allows for something to exist? And then, yeah, again, what I just think would be cool. What is the emotional or mechanical experience that I think players need or want most? We get an opportunity to try a lot of stuff, and when you exist in that space, it gives you a very tangible appreciation for all the environments that you work on that don't have that same freedom.
Yeah, I can really see that being the case. You mentioned there about when you're starting a new project, you'll think about, well, can we do this within the structure that we have? I guess that's a way of saying scale. Like, I assume that's a question of scale and, how fast can we do something? What are your thoughts on scale? And I guess linked to that as well, sustainability in today's market. We're looking at a very turbulent time in games across, not just in AAA, but across all facets of the industry. So yeah, what are your thoughts on scale and sustainability, and how would you describe your approach to these two concepts? I know you've touched on it a little bit there, though.
When we're talking about scale, we're talking about machines. The size of your machine defines the type of thing you can build. And that's something that stuck with me as I discovered as a journalist, as I started to walk into the game development space, and as I started Strange Scaffold, which is very simply like, the larger your machine is, the more you need to justify doing something, to the point that it can end up biting you in the ass. I'm just trying to look for a less gauche way to say it, but yeah, when you have a machine the size of, say, an Electronic Arts as it currently exists, or an Activision, I've, as just part of a little cursory look, went like, how many games did they publish a year 10, 20 years ago? And you have those giant publishers publishing 10 games a year, 15, 20 games a year, especially the further back you go. And that number becomes less and less over time, not just because of the sheer size of the games they produce now, but also because a $5 million game bringing a $10 million return doesn't matter when just the budget for your marketing department in a month is $10 million. So thinking in a very neurodivergent way about machines and the impact that the machine you're within will have on your final project and on what you can afford, quote unquote, to bring to players is something that stuck with me for a very long time. So I think the scale of the industry is such where we are very tale of two cities, best of times, worst of times.
Yeah.
We are going to see the most potent creative achievements of our entire medium right now. We're also going to see, sometimes not even for the fault of the project, the developers, or the publisher, the greatest, most abysmal failures of our medium. And that wouldn't have to be the case if every project was not positioned and every machine was not positioned to only accept Hail Mary bets. But that's where we're at. So you don't get to have a game like I Am Your Beast because you're already having the goggles on of, will this bring in $3 million? It's really hard to look at anything and say this is going to bring in $3 million, which is part of the reason that budgets keep going up, because you can at least say, oh, the art is so pretty, you can see it selling $3 million. And that drives people to make riskier machines, bigger machines for single games that take up a higher risk index, which force you to port to more places at launch, which increases your logistical burden and means that you can patch your games more slowly across all platforms. And it's a multiplicative effect, which is why I'm so aggressive at talking about this publicly, because players don't get to even see the first part of the building of the machine and the logic of the machine. All they know is that they're getting less variety in their games. They're seeing less of a consistent quality bar in their games. There is some deep yearning that is not being satisfied, and they don't have the language to understand that anything is changing at all. So I'm doing what I can to help bridge that gap and do it for the sake of players and the developers who love making games for them.
Yeah. I love the imagery of a machine. There's something about this, gigantic belching piece of metal and the effects it has, and like you say, all its tendrils going out. I think it's a really beautiful way of describing the modern industry. And in comparison, when you think of what you're saying, about how you're approaching it in a much smaller scale, I guess, for want of a better way of phrasing it, but how much more efficient and clean and how much maybe less intrusive it is on players' lives, almost like it's not demanding so much of their attention and space.
And it's not unprecedented, which is the weird thing. Like, people give me a certain social presence that, while it is flattering, I don't necessarily feel it's inherently merited. I'm not saying anything really new. Like, if I say, like, hey, if you have a time and a budget, you should make your game in that. People go, oh my gosh, holy shit, he's an innovator. That's just how things usually work in other places that aren't broken. So in a similar way, yeah, like the idea of making things at different scales. You have your blockbuster, you have your mid-sized project, and you have your indie bet. The best moments in different entertainment mediums, even in recent memory, have been when projects of all scales were coming to the market in that way. When film in the 90s was thriving because you had multiple distribution channels, including rentals and the theater, and like a thriving DVD market, for example, DVD and VHS. Like, that drove film to be creating new franchises all the time. Things like The Matrix. Kevin Smith, right alongside shit like Jurassic Park. People went in droves to watch both because you were providing everything. And games, at a certain point, I would say 6th gen is really good as a representative of that era. What is making your Call of Duties, but also making your Katamari Damashis. Because of the amount of people making games now, we're still getting a spread to a degree, but especially in more traditional machines like, say, indie game publishing, we are seeing a tangible change in the games that get produced. Sometimes for the better. We are, for example, getting more time built into development cycles for accessibility. That's so important and so cool. But also, more games get canceled midway through their publishing contract because the publisher isn't sure it's going to bring in $1 million revenue minimum, and if they aren't sure about it before launch, then they won't continue forward with it. Or they want you to have already invested enough of your time and cash for it to like pop off on a Steam Next Fest. When I'm Your Beast had the explosive showing that it did at PC Gaming Show, we had people knock on our door not to go back to other projects they had passed on, because like so many people pass on I Am Your Beast, right? They knocked on the door to ask if we wanted another publisher alongside Frosty Pop. Like, we had 70,000 wish lists in like 4 days, and they were like, hey, you want a second publisher? And we're like, the game's coming out in 3 months. What are you talking about? And that's the space right now. So, yeah, I'm not saying anything particularly revolutionary. I'm just pointing out to precedent and to things that work for players. They love their Balatros. They love their Destinies. They can have space for both because both fill different spaces in their lives. And instead, we have a cultural environment and moment that's asking, well, what's the Balatro of Destiny? And if you think about that statement for 4 seconds, you will have an aneurysm.
That is the most cursed sentence I've ever heard someone say out loud. What is the Balatro of Destiny? The problem is I'd play that. I'm the problem in that sentence. You're right. What you're saying is it makes sense, right? A lot of people will talk about it, but why do you think people are so surprised when you say this? Is it just because we're living in, raw economy capitalism, or do you think it's just a moment in games that will pivot and turn? Like, why do people think you're a maverick for saying that?
I've thought about this. I think there is a temptation to create savior narratives in any medium and space. It's the Warren Spector says he hates games being attributed to one person, says the creator of Deus Ex and Thief. Problem. It is nice to be recognized. I do respect and acknowledge that I do some really cool stuff. I do also want the precedent that I'm pointing to, the people I'm inspired by, the teammates I work with, folks like our studio producer, Candace Dirt, our composer who we work with on a lot of stuff like RJ Lake, Tom Vanita, the guy who I made an Airport for Aliens Can Run by Dogs with, and Teenage Demon Slayer Society with, and a really cool thing we'll be able to talk about within the next year.
Ooh, okay.
With, like, I try to uplift voices along the way while people throw flowers or a perception. But I think one of the reasons it's treated as so maverick is because people, and this is true regardless of medium, I think, people acknowledge results and not process, which is where the Frosty Pop deal was so important and why we keep working with them, is because they were one of the first partners I ever worked with who understood that it is our processes that let us do what we do. So if you just stick Strange Scaffold on a 5-year, $4 million project, that's not a binary choice. We don't have a machine built to do that. And we would be producing something fundamentally different with a different equation and risk than what we do. But like the seeing the time and money as a linear equation of quality or of market reach is disregards process, and it is deeply prevalent in almost any medium. When a big horror movie comes out, you see the news within a couple of months that they're like starting the new cinematic universe. It's like that. It's cool that more people will get a bag. However, the idea of just building a cinematic universe of anything that does well, it misses the point of what brought it there in the first place. It could be the coolest thing for the creators to do is to build that cinematic universe. The coolest thing could just be supporting the next thing they want to do. But there's that disconnect. So, yeah, I think people ask me all the time, how do you do it? And I've gotten kind of tired of answering because I'm very transparent and I say it every time.
Yeah.
And it's like watching water go off a duck's back, where I'm like, well, we make projects at a variety of scales. Our priority is not shipping the biggest game of all time. It's shipping the next game that players don't know that they need, yada, yada, yada. We try to hit our time and our budget. We create a really constrained scope. Speaking of, here's a project with a constrained scope that I think is the next thing that we're really excited about. They blink twice and say, well, is this a game you really want to make? Like, can you make this something that really has an opportunity to break into the zeitgeist? And it's like, what did we just talk about?
Yeah. Did you not listen to what I just said? Yeah.
And when I talk to developers, I'll say it's a very similar situation where it's like, they're like, how do you do it? And I'm like, well, we make a game in a year or less typically. And then we always have the next game along the way. We build these games simultaneously and they go, cool. So I want to make a 4-year magnum opus. It's like, great, you aren't doing the same thing we are. Yeah. So it's not going to look the same. No. Promoting it won't look the same. Developing it won't look the same. I think we're treated as a very long way of saying, I try to uplift the voices around me. I try to speak to how much I'm looking at a wider context in which we exist to compile and develop these ideas and this strategy of how to exist in this medium. And we look like mavericks because we're doing things that other people do. And it's not that other people cannot do it. It's that I say what to do and the other people don't feel that the process is also how you achieve the thing.
That's a really good answer. The inherent frustration in answering a question and then them asking another question that counteracts what you've just said is like the fear that every journalist has when doing an interview, right?
It's not something I've run into on this podcast. Listen to Indieventure. Let's go.
You'll see. You've still got questions for you. You touched on there about people, the Maverick thing and these things that people project on you. I actually have a question that I was really chewing on when I was prepping for this. So many people use the word prolific when they describe you. And I'm just curious, how do you feel about that? And is it a word you'd use to describe yourself?
I don't use it to describe myself, but I do like it because it expresses, again, a difference in process. So I don't work full-time at a studio. There are burdens that come with that, including a lack of health insurance. But there's also the opportunity that means I get to learn from so many environments and bring so much experience from having worked in multiple environments, different genres, different people, pulling from research in different areas, that it is a trade. I think that when people call me prolific, that is one way of acknowledging a greater thing, which is that I'm a different shaped person because I come into projects maintaining a different shape. Yeah, I guess the upside of that is that when you're recognized as prolific, you get an opportunity to do that thing more places. And the bitter edge to it is that while prolific acknowledges I do a lot of things in a lot of places, and it lets me have a wider holistic view that a game developer doesn't typically get to have because they're heads down on one project for 4 years. That's cool, but it often usually is not accompanied, again, by a larger idea of, and this is part of an intentional practice in person that only gets to exist in this way, which is where you will have sometimes a dissonance arise where it's like, what's the best term for this? Sometimes an interesting, invalidation of experience will occur as a result, where it's like, well, there's one side of this in indie, which is like, well, you haven't really committed your heart to a project for 5 years. It's like,
oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I've come in as a guy to parachute in on those projects and make them shippable. But yeah, I haven't chosen the same path, which doesn't signal a... Fuck, I'm realizing in real time, it's almost like the college conversation you get into, where it's like people are like, ooh, and you'll see this as a wider cultural thing, is like what people attach to a college degree is there can be a person, and I don't just say this because I don't have a college degree, but like there can be a person who is intelligent, has a skill set, maybe like an on-the-ground experience, but it's like, ooh, but do you have that piece of paper? What does that piece of paper say about you in a wider context? And it's like, are we talking, do you want the piece of paper or do you want the person who can do the job? I think that's a really important thing to define for, say, a job position. It's one reason that indie people find it really hard to break into AAA is because they get hit with, well, you haven't worked on a AAA game. And it's like, well, one, that may mean that person is able to bring different things to the table. And two, you don't get to work on a AAA game without having worked on a AAA game. I've now worked indie AAA, original IP, licensed IP. I've had the fortune to exist in a very, very broad variety of contexts. But yeah, sometimes the bitter edge of it is people will be like, well, you haven't been on one project for 4 years and had it crash and burn. It's like, yeah, I didn't do that. Sorry.
Yeah. That is interesting, though. I had never really thought about how that narrative about indie developers that we all love, right? Like, oh, you spent 8 years and you were that classic, your desk was a cardboard box and it was a laptop from 1993 and you made the best-selling indie game of the year. Like that is like quite a rigid structure of a narrative, right? That we like to put on individuals. And yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a hell of an answer to what do you think about the term prolific, but I appreciate you making the space for it.
No, I realized it would probably lead to an interesting conversation based on the other questions I've asked already.
Thank you.
So it would be great to touch on a couple of your games. So I actually first encountered you because of your contributions to Hypnospace Outlaw, which is one of my favorite games of all time. So as a Hypnospace sicko, I think I'm legally obligated to ask, how did you become involved in that project, and what was it like to write for Hypnospace?
The way I got involved is I knew Jay Tholen when I was a literal teenager. I was one of the first people to speedrun Dropsy. I think I managed to cut down this is before release. I managed to cut down my playthrough to like 8 minutes.
Whoa, I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I beta tested it, and Dropsy is amazing. It was very validating finding a Christian in the games medium because I didn't know. I knew about folks like Ken Levine. I didn't know that folks like Jay existed. And seeing Dropsy not just be a really amazing game, but like a game that reflected the beliefs of the creator without being a quote unquote Christian game. Because it is a game that is mechanically about love and kindness in the face of a world that does not even like that you're there. It really spoke to me. And so I kept in touch with Jay. Hypnospace Outlaw, the Kickstarter happened. I tapped on his shoulder at the time. I was like, hey, love to work on that at some point. And we just keep talking, and eventually, the opportunity arises. I'm writing games. I'm not doing stuff with Strange Scaffold yet, but I'm working on a lot of projects in a lot of situations, and I'm already getting my very shipping-focused mindset embedded and ingrained in my soul. And Jay says, hey, do you want to work together on this? And my role on it became, there was a lot of writing already in the game. It's a very writing-heavy game. But it's asking, how do you make this a shippable journey? So among other things, at one point, Hypnospace was supposed to take place across 30 in-game days or something like that. And I went, well, players will either expect you to produce 30 days of content for every single character and webpage, which will kill you, or they're going to get frustrated with needle in a haystack looking for where the updates come in. Something that you can remember as an experience from the time, doing like web ring stuff and being like, shit, my webcomic creator hasn't put out their thing. It's Wednesday, you lazy bastard. But it's not necessarily maybe the experience we want to, of the Y2K era experiences. Maybe that's not the one we want to replicate. So I proposed that we divide the timeline for small spoiler for people who haven't played Hypnospace Outlaw, but like, when you hit a point where you can see a big picture of the wider game, every single page existing in like roughly 3 to 4 chunks means that you can have larger deviations between each chunk that are narratively relevant, satisfy what the player is looking for, and give a greater sense of progression. And it was stuff like that was outside of also quite a bit of writing. Was the type of thing I brought to the table, is how to structure this world, approaching it as a fictional world, and say, what's the path through it alongside folks like Mike and Jay. And it's a big part of why Strange Scaffold now exists, too. Because everything came up to that day. I was sick to my stomach. Everyone is dog-tired. The reviews come out. And we are terrified of what John Walker will say because the game is buggy. And he has, in reviews of the time, even if he liked the game, if it was buggy in the pre-release period, he might just tear you a new one. And then that's it. And instead, the John Walker review is glowing. The reception of the game is that we did something really significant, and we were still very tired, but there was that collective breathe out, and I went, man, I never want to do this again. I never want to be boiling on a thing, cooking on a thing with people for years at a time, and the entire fates of our career leads up to one moment that we don't have any control over. So, yeah, Strange Scaffold saying, I will work on multiple things. My studio will develop multiple things, each, and take away the burden from each one of having to be the best game of all time. It just needs to be the game for you, player, and to exist in a wider context where if you didn't discover it when it came out of release, maybe you come later because you've seen another game I've worked on. Or maybe, again, like a director's work, you're like, you know what? I'm going to go back to a director or a musician. Like, I'm going to go back to that third album. I think I get what they were going for now. I wanted to create that wider context. And Hypnospace and the pressure of release and wanting to not do that to myself psychologically, and also, frankly, like to my collaborators, of like having them witness a moment not as like, cool, we see what the players think of that one, let's move on to the next one, but as a climactic moment that determines their entire livelihood and perspective. Yeah. I didn't want anyone to risk not being able to feed their kids because an Airport for Aliens currently run by dogs didn't sell copies. So, Hypnospace ended up being... It's one of the things I'm most honored still to have contributed to, but it's also a thing of like, it is a peak example of what does it look like for an indie to put 6 years into a thing and bare their heart and find in that golden moment people do love it. I saw that was a very specific machine, and it was like, do I want that type of machine, or do I want to make a machine that lets me do different things? I chose the other one.
I can totally understand why, and everything you've said so far, like, it makes a lot of sense. I was going to ask a question about Strange Scaffold. All of your games, they have very different themes, they're of different genres. I was going to ask a question of what's the connective thread that runs between them? Like, what makes a game a Strange Scaffold game? But have you answered that? Is the answer that it's the scale of it, and it's making sure that it's sustainable, it's making sure the people that work on it can deliver it within a certain time frame, that they're not waiting years, like you say, to make sure they can feed their kids? Or do you think there is something different, that a connective tissue that runs between them all?
I think again, this is where I've talked to people about the sustainability of Strange Scaffold. I'm like, there is a danger point in it, which is me. If I die, this studio dies. And believe it or not, that was intentional, especially at the time. There was a lot of shootings of people with my level of melanin in their skin. And I was like, hey, if someone wants the next Strange Scaffold game, they better become a real ally. They better jump in front of some bullets if something were to occur. Yeah. But yeah, like the idea of the point of failure inside of Strange Scaffold is me. It's also point of advantage is me, is like a very intentional thing that I embarked upon. So the things that I think identify a Strange Scaffold game is that they use constraints and limitations very intentionally. They are not trying to be everything or quote unquote do the ultimate vision of a premise. They're trying to find, with razor focus, what is the thing this game needs to be itself. And I think it's like that focus, it's that intentional limitations, which does also speak to its scope and scale. But I think it's like me. It's really leaning into trying to, in a more equitable way as an auteur, say, how do we create space for all these voices on a team? Folks like Dan Pierce on I Am Your Beast, and how much that speaks to his creative sensibilities alongside my own, that I think results in these titles and why they feel wild and expressive in the same way that I really valued when I was early in my game development and game playing journeys, of saying, I love that I can identify a Tim Schafer game. Why don't I get this more often? Now we can identify with more regularity, like Josh Sawyer. I don't know if Josh Sawyer has always been the name that he has in that regard, but like You got Tim, you got Josh, you've got a few other creators like that, and then this kind of wide gulf of people still having massive impacts on games, but you just like maybe among other things just don't know their names. And I wanted to embrace that responsibility, but also that existential the existential joy and burden of being a type of guy. You can get mad at that type of guy. You can also say, damn, I respect it. I don't love it in this moment, but I respect it.
The word responsibility, I think, is a good one to use in terms of that.
We have conversations inside the team of just like, hey, every time you do a tweet, it can bring massive eyes, and a tweet about a totally unrelated thing can bring eyes to our games and to our creative perspective. That's rad. One tweet can also mean that this studio is dead. I've talked a lot here about like creative choices, creative compromise, and the expression of how that also impacts my daily life is legitimately tangible. It's
yeah.
I'm living a life where I have the joy of being representative of a studio and creative approach. I'm living a life where I don't write tweet threads like that anymore. To go all the way back to the beginning of that callback, because one, I haven't found the right topic yet. But two, at that time even, and this is, 4 years ago, I got told that like games legit got lost a day or two of productivity because people were reading that thread. I was told about it being shared in like the Ubisoft Global Slack. I realized I had a very wide approach for any given thing. And so I wanted to, if I was going to tell that type of joke, I wanted to tell that joke with full acknowledgement of the responsibility of what it could have for the impact of others as well as my own team. When the Baldur's Gate 3 stuff happened last year, this was right before El Paso Elsewhere came out. The conversation occurred internally. Are we going to have our entire launch impacted because a tweet thread calling for empathy and sustainability focused mindsets gets taken in a malicious context and misused elsewhere? Everything is choices, and I'm very grateful for the trust that my collaborators have invested in me, which is part of why I try to handle it so intentionally.
The Xalavier that walks away from the computer that, isn't on a podcast talking to a guy from England, like, how does that weight sit with you as a person, knowing that you can tweet a joke and it might have consequences? Like, how does that sit with you?
This is where, again, the neurodivergent part of my brain really appreciates and desires acknowledgement, because I think there's a lot of people in that place and in that space. Quite a few of those people have made sometimes dramatic studio structure and life decisions based off of that weight. And you just, for the most part, don't see it discussed or acknowledged, which makes it harder when you end up in that position. One really interesting thing to see is when someone pops off in the indie space, someone like a Rami Ismail or a Daniel Mullins or someone might come alongside them and say, so, you've sold 1 million copies of an indie game, and everyone is treating you like you are God and also Satan. Let's talk about that a little bit. Yeah, the weight is one I took on intentionally because I knew I had seen enough. I'd been in a part of enough productions at that point. I had worked on a little over 40 games at the time. I'd been in enough productions where I knew somewhat what the weight would be and what you get an advantage and what you get as a disadvantage, and I chose it. And if you chose it, it is a little bit easier to bear because it didn't get foisted upon you. I'd say the second thing is just it's it is a tangible sense of impact, which is hard when you're a guy who loves to do bits. I love that I can bring attention towards, say, an industry issue or towards someone else doing really cool work in games. I really, really fell in love with, I'm trying to think of which game it is now, but I tend to fall in love with especially like older titles, and I say, you know what was dope as hell? The Star Wars Battlefront 2 Galactic campaign mode, Tony Hawk Underground, and Eric Sparrow being the one child who should be ejected into the sun, and it should be live broadcast for the entire world to see it. Like, and having other people say hell yeah, and having those developers really reach out my DMs and say, yeah, people didn't, especially at the time, even maybe talk about this game as cool or important. I got to see people love something I had worked on today. Thank you. Wow. I try not to think about it too much. I try not to get God complex about it. I just try to be really intentional about being positive, calling for the things I really believe in, and whenever and wherever possible, mitigating that with being a goofy little guy.
You once did a tweet where you said that you goofed too close to the sun, and I really need you to know that became part of my daily rotation of phrases. It really is just a beautiful little sentence. Sometimes you got to be a goofy little guy, haven't you? I think it just really grounds you on the world.
I mean, man, that's such a great example of that too, where it's like goofing so close to the sun. This is where the long-term perspective also becomes really thorny in the sense of having to be viewed through an individual lens. And I want every studio and every game developer working on a game to be able to create holistic situations like that. Because if that had been the one game we're working on for 5 years, that would have been rough. That would have just been real rough. But El Paso Elsewhere came out that same year. A lot of people who never would have heard about Strange Scaffold otherwise came in through the door because some guy got his game temporarily banned from the North American eShop.
This is in reference to Sunshine Shuffle, right? Which was, you made a joke about how it was teaching kids to gamble. Was that what am I misremembering that?
No, you aren't. I was like, it doesn't teach children to gamble. And I'd always be winking and saying it doesn't teach children to gamble. Next thing I know, gambling allegations means that it is temporarily removed from a storefront. And same conversation actually occurred around click holding. It was like the fact that the studio was making it at all. People said this might end your career, and being really intentional about how we talked about the game from the beginning. Like the very first TikTok I did about it wasn't, I'm doing this wild click hold game. It's like click hold like cuckold. Ah! It was me saying, we're making something really weird and we have to be really careful about it. And I brought people in from the beginning onto like, here's why the thing we're making is important, but also why the goofster wants to be really intentional in what I say about it and how. This is so many of the questions in this have come back to intentionality of structure and intentionality of context. And I have fucked that up in the past. I'm going to find new and fun ways to explore that in the future. And I just hope that along that way, I can really just continue to uplift the voices of the people around me. If we do right by developers, we do right by our players. If we make things at different scales, we give our players the games they deserve to see and that they deserve to discover. And I just hope I can keep making the next unexpected game you didn't know you needed for as long as I can.
That's beautifully put.
They turned a man into a beast right in front of me. The Only warmth that I see steams from his sleeve so bloodily. He's naked, see a black man pounding the pavement. Every crack in the ground is a burden. He's taking their place in bets, spending their jets. Thin-haired bastards craving sweat, salivating on a human marionette. Nervous fingers grip the cage they built and shake it. I want this man to help me break it.
If not for me, for himself. But I doubt that the torture is aware of his health. I want wealth, cause the goal of this age is to be the panting evil out there rattling the cage. I want help, if not for us, for our kin. And a little debt is damned before they ever begin. I want wealth, cause the goal of this age is to be the panting evil out there rattling the cage.
I want to ask some questions about two of your recent games. We'll start with El Paso Elsewhere, which we named as one of the best indies of last year. It absolutely floored me. It was incredible. I want to ask one question specifically about the story. So James Savage is a private investigator who must enter into the swirling heart of an El Paso motel to prevent his ex, Dracula, from ending the world. And it becomes quickly apparent that Dracula caused Savage a lot of trauma during their relationship as a result of coercive control and abusive behaviors. Personally, without wanting to self-disclose too much, this was a depiction that I felt was very powerful. But can you speak more to the decisions behind this narrative and what interested you in these characters and their dynamic?
So I was really compelled in the development process to, again, show a different layer of relationship. Relationships and interesting, unique, weird relationships are a common theme in my work. An Airport for Aliens Come Run by Dogs has a healthy long-distance relationship because I was so tired of people treating long-distance relationships as an inherent death of or purgatory of love. You've got in Life Eater, you have a fucked up course of best friendship that becomes something more than that, but also exactly that at the same time. In the tangible ambiguity of care there was something I wanted to play with, and that the entire team worked really hard to find in each separate discipline like a layer of communicating that. El Paso Elsewhere, I wanted to depict a reality of an abusive relationship that I think is under covered and under discussed, where just because someone has hurt you doesn't mean you stop loving them. You can even have gone through therapy, have a full acknowledgement of what they have done to you and how you as a person have been forever altered. And still, you will be walking down a DVD aisle and see a movie you watched together, and it will hit you, and you'll have a flashback, and it hurts. Because there was still, even if it wasn't a good time, even if it wasn't a good moment, the good in it that you felt there sticks with you. So I really wanted to honor that. I wanted to show a male survivor of this abuse. I wanted to show an abusive relationship where the abuse was emotional rather than physical. When someone never lays their hands on you, how does that complicate the feelings of, I was harmed though, I was irreparably altered? All of those things hit people who have been survivors of various types of relationship abuse, and it's perhaps ambitious to take that on in a narrative about shooting werewolves in slow motion in the face after you've dived off of a wall. But that's what video games are for. So a really important point actually for that early in the narrative was, or earlier in the writing process, was going to be having Dracula put James into a situation where, long story short, she's acting very aggressive out of nowhere. He gets backed into a corner, he puts his hands out just as like a stop. She bumps against his hands, falls through a plate glass coffee table, brushes herself off like nothing happened. But because any physical contact occurred, he feels like he is no longer innocent and therefore able to escape the situation or see himself as an innocent. That is something that is intentionally done by, intentionally and unintentionally used by abusers to create a situation where, like, even if I've hit you, if you've hit me back, you aren't clean anymore, so you stay. And I realized, I was thinking through this, and I was really thinking through the statement that this could make, having this be a plot beat. And then I was just like, also like, damn, the optics of this this is complicated enough that it can be misconstrued and change the ability for people to be able to, for people, regardless of where they are on a spectrum of understanding this from a lived experience, can potentially discard the rest of his entire journey. So ironically, a story about not having to be a perfect victim to find empathy, I had to find ways to make him perfect and clean as a victim to deal with that empathy. And I had to acknowledge the part that race also played in it, because here's the hot goth baddie, and there's a black man here. And when you associate with that cultural depictions and sensations of aggression, of, again, innocency, what is the innocency afforded to people of color? It was ironically something that impacted I'm Your Beast as well, because there's a very, very early, like, minimal script draft where it's much more Doom guy, much less human, very pulpy. And the idea of pure pulp in an environment where doing that without any further context, when you do have a main character who's a person of color, you got to do some fourth dimensional math. You got to do fourth dimensional taking of risks as well as mitigating of it. And this pulp thing it's still pulp, but it's also got way more nuance than originally planned for it, because as production began, I was like, if you've just got a black rage monster going around kicking people in the back so hard that their limbs explode, what does that bring into the world?
Mm-hmm.
Does that story still land? Do people believe he is justified for doing it? And for good and for ill, I chose a different direction.
Before I ask this one final question, I do just want to say El Paso Elsewhere is stunning. I really do think that it's a beautiful game, and I think the amount of thought that you put into it shows. It's a really special thing. With I Am Your Beast, there's a similarity with El Paso Elsewhere in that they're both, I interpret them as they center on struggles for freedom. You know, it's about trying to break a cycle of violence and control and to journey into the heart of trauma. And even though they have, like, quote unquote traditional depictions of violence, the impact of your actions feel distinct due to the underlying motivations driving them. And you've touched on this a little bit, so maybe you could expand on that if it feels relevant. But what interested you about using violence as a central game mechanic and as a storytelling device in both of those games?
I think violence in games, this is kind of like where discomfort comes in with click holding, to bring in yet another Strange Scaffold game, was like, there's a lot of games about cutting people apart and being cut apart. The idea of, this is partially inspired by, say, Twitch culture, where a female streamer will just do a normal action and people will be like, you're trying to bait people into finding your material masturbatory. Active reinterpretation of your actions is a really psychologically dissonant effect that games don't do a lot with. So you clicking a tally counter, which if you were just in a white box is just do-do-do-do-do. Actually kind of a satisfying noise, kind of a satisfying control. But that's nothing. Having someone reinterpret it changes the entire dynamic in ways that I love when games do that. I loved when I played Max Payne when I was a teenager, which shares some space in my brain with Hotline Miami. And the violence in that felt gross, and it finally gave me language to say Call of Duty feels less M for mature than this, because when I shoot someone, their body blasts backward, and every time I quick load in order to make sure I survive this room full of guns, my interaction and the intentionality of my violence changes the way this otherwise standard shooter scenario goes down. That's compelling to me. It was a transformative moment. So in a similar way, like El Paso Elsewhere, we talked internally about, like, what is the boost that painkillers give you? Say even things like damage, because what are those mechanics saying? Limitations on a project really help in that regard, of saying your punches are not very powerful in I'm Your Beast, and that's okay. That's just like, if that's fine. The important part is that you can punch, so we still have punching in, but they don't do much damage, and that's because there's more effective ways for you to be moving through that world. If you make the punch more powerful, it says something, it does something. As I'm talking, I realize we're just talking about ludonarrative dissonance again. Fuck. But yeah, like, Mechanics and context are, I think, everything. Life Eater is... I come back to horror again and again because horror is so much a genre that benefits from context, both cultural and internal. Mm-hmm. And that's very much based around, this is a game that feels more violent because you are just shooting someone because you are step by step invading their life and privacy. You're doing it on purpose. You're doing it intentionally. You're going through the thought process of, I'm going to do this and then this, and create a culture of fear around a person's home. And step by step, clicking the thing and pressing confirm means you reckon with that. I Am Your Beast says that this entire thing shouldn't have happened, and it's just one person, for increasingly petty reasons, saying, I'm not going to let this go. And it impacts a lot of people's lives, including your own. Nature of violence in El Paso, elsewhere in I Am Your Beast, at the end of the day, is just like existing as human counterpoints, existing as active processing of trauma in the case of El Paso, elsewhere. And I think it's really important and significant that in both of those games, reflections of those characters and their journeys, where we want the player to be, is they would rather this not have happened. He begs Dracula to say, please just stop. Mm-hmm. And catharsis is not found in killing her. Catharsis is found in talking with her afterwards. So so much credit goes to the teams that I have the honor of collaborating with in how they take on the burden of responsibility too, and saying what each one of these cool thing, how that actually is processed as a real event and a point for nuance rather than simply a mechanic.
We'll try not to blow smoke up your ass at the end of this interview, but I've played a lot of games like I Am Your Beast, and I finished it this week, and I think that consideration elevates it and is why I really loved it. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it. I have one last very quick question. We end all of our episodes with this. I'm desperate to ask this to you as well. We end with what we call a hyperfixation. It's the thing that we are currently focused on. It can be anything. Do you have a hyperfixation? Oh, you're rubbing your hands together. That's very exciting for me.
Yes.
Xalavier, what is your hyperfixation?
So, current hyperfixation is I have recently gotten married.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We are putting together a home together. In a lot of ways, we're doing that like in a full process for the first time. My hyperfixation right now is thinking about what it means to, because I've lived alone before. I've had a home before. But the idea of, especially with another person, building a space and choosing things to go into that space and the impact that even the division of your mutual time in building that space versus like, you got to eat, you got to spend time together, how you do the opposite of that one really messed up unpacking level where no one created space for you. Yeah. It's really, really, really fascinating. So my hyperfixation is actually on a wider level. A nerdy idea I had early in my career was when I was first, especially living alone. Why the fuck is there a cultural expectation that one person is supposed to handle all of this? Mm-hmm. You're supposed to travel, exercise, cook, clean, work, socialize. All of those things you have 24 hours in a day. You're supposed to sleep at some point. Mm-hmm. And it feels like that's a cultural expectation that is not realistic for us, especially a young single person. Like that's just really difficult to do on your own, and especially hard to do consistently. So extrapolating that to now, like sharing these responsibilities as well as these decisions with another person, like finding the joy in that, but also the focus needed for that of like, do I spend an hour assembling this thing from IKEA? Is that the most important thing I could be doing? Is this the thing where does this push our home together? it's really basic life and consideration stuff, but I'm really fascinated by the systemic nature of what it means to make quote unquote meaningless choices. And it retroactively makes me even angrier at the game design principle of, or the game design discussion around false choices. No choice is false. The fact that you click anything that is different is actually a difference maker. I remember the conversation around Telltale back when, where it was like, everyone accepted and knew that there was limitations to the format, but also they were like, choices! And my hyperfixation, you're hearing me process in real time, and I apologize for that. I'm realizing my hyperfixation is realizing there is no such thing as a false choice. There is this teacup says something about us in our home, but also it's not that serious, but also it's really important that we talk about what this teacup means and what it means to the individuals involved. And even if, and that going back into my game design sensibilities, where I'm looking at some things, because one of the things that we're going to be talking about starting this year likely is that we're mid-development on another project that had to get canceled for the studio survival. We finally found in Frosty Pop a partner to bring it to life. We're making our RPG. And
wow.
We're making it in a very Strange Scaffold way.
Yeah.
And talking about choices in that context and being very intentional with, especially with the constraints and limitations that we put on our projects. What matters is not this choice on an existential level and how much it branches a story. What matters is that you've made that choice and how you now see that choice in a wider matrix of choices. That is my current hyperfixation.
Yeah, love that. Absolutely love that. What a way to end the podcast. Touching a little bit on intentionality as well there, I think, which it was definitely the theme of this chat. I wish you all the best and many years of happiness. Congratulations on your marriage. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. This has been an absolute delight. Thank you.
The pleasure and honor is mine. Thank you.
Indieventure is a video games podcast created, produced, hosted, and edited by Rachel Watts, Rebecca Jones, and me, Liam Richardson. For more information, including a list of every game we mentioned in this episode, make sure to check out our website, indieventurepodcast.co.uk. You can get in touch by sending your questions, comments, and feedback to contact@indieventurepodcast.co.uk. You can support the show by rating us 5 stars and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast provider of choice. Some of the games we talk about on the show may have been provided to us for free for review consideration. Our intro music and stings were composed for us by Ollie Newbury. Check the episode description to hear more of his excellent tunes. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks for another episode of Indieventure. Bye for now.